Welcome, everybody, to the Farooq Mustafa Memorial Friday lecture at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Ahmed Shamsi, and I am happy and honored to introduce today our distinguished guest, Scott Lucas, who is an associate professor of Islamic Studies at the School of Middle East and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. He is a son of the program, finished his PhD under Wadad al-Qadi here in the early 2000s. And I am lucky to have known him for many years, I think more than 15 years. When I was a graduate student, I invited him to a lecture at Harvard, and he was so generous as to come. And it's, he has been a wonderful colleague and friend ever since. And his work has been very influential in the field, including and particularly in fields of hadith, law, and tafsir. His first monograph, which is based on his dissertation called Constructive Critics, Hadith Literature and the Articulation of Sunni Islam, was then followed by extensive work on several important articles, including on Bukhari, including on law. He has published a partial translation of Tabari's exegesis of the Quran, and in the last couple of years he has worked on Zaydi exegesis of the Quran, really important, very rich literature that nevertheless is basically unknown in Western scholarship. And so he has really been taking up he's carrying out a kind of a fard kifaya, if you know what I mean, taking up a responsibility that kind of we all should be taking up, but he's doing it for us, so we don't have to do it. And we can see his deep involvement in this literature by the fact that even today's title is in rhymed prose, a guide that is clear to Zaydi tafsir. So please join me in welcoming Scott Lucas.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for that very generous introduction. And it really wasn't too hard to say yes to go to Harvard. But thank you for making it sound like I agonized over the decision. But thank you again for this invitation. I'm going to try to share my screen now. I should know how to do this. Okay. Everybody still there? Okay, good. And I'd like to thank, in particular, Zach Winters. I think we've been in email communication about a year with various invitations for me to come out to join or present some of my research. So I'm delighted to finally be able to do that. And that, Zach, you didn't give up on me, and you didn't let a pandemic get in the way of inviting me to return to Chicago. And all the folks on the Shi'i Studies group. I don't recall there being a Shi'i Studies group 19 years ago when I was, or 20 years ago when I was a student. So it's wonderful to see that this group is active and doing great work. And so I hope we stay in touch for many years to come. And it's a real honor to be part of the Farooq Mustafa Memorial Lecture. Farooq was a legendary teacher when I was a graduate student. He was always a presence at events like this, and he's sorely missed by everyone who knew him. So thank you for including me and for dedicating the lecture series in his honor. I have 3 goals today. This will be a somewhat descriptive talk for reasons that I think will become clear. The first is to provide information that is helpful in locating Zaydi books and manuscripts. The second is to introduce the Zaydi tradition of composing and copying Quran commentaries. And then the third one is to show that Zaydi tafsir generally appears to have far more in common with Sunni tafsir than with Imami Shi'i tafsir. We might explore some of the reasons why as well. So let's start with a tale of 2 handbooks. As most of you are probably aware, last year, the long-awaited Oxford Handbook of Quranic Studies came out under the editorial leadership of Mustafa Shah and Muhammad Abdul Halim. It's a very rich resource. It's a wonderful book. And if you go all the way to the last section of varieties of tafsir, there are chapters on 12er Shi'i commentaries, Ismaili scholarship on tafsir, Ibadi commentary, Sufi commentary, theological commentary, philosophical commentary, aesthetically oriented interpretations of the Quran, tafsir, and science. But there's something I felt was missing. Where are the Zaydis? And so there's, I think, some law that whenever one handbook is written, that means another handbook is underway on a similar topic. So fortunately, there's another handbook underway, the Handbook of Quranic Hermeneutics, edited by Professor George Tamer. And he reached out to me some time ago and asked if I'd be interested in writing a chapter on Zaydi tafsir. And I said, it's going to take a little time because I don't think there's much secondary literature. And he said, that's okay. You know, it's a handbook. These things take time to cook over many years. And so much of what I'm presenting today are reflections on what I've been learning in order to provide this chapter for a forthcoming handbook on hermeneutics. I'll just take a minute to review where the Zaydis are located, and I'll have a little bit of history soon as well. But most Zaydis are found in roughly this area illustrated by the hexagon here in northern Yemen in the highlands. I had the pleasure of studying in Yemen twice when I was much younger and when Yemen was a great place to go to study Arabic. The area that's circled, Saada in the north, is in some ways the, you might say, intellectual, spiritual capital, although there are many towns and cities on various mountains throughout the northern highlands where much Zaydi scholarship has taken place over the last several centuries. What are some of the salient qualities of Zaydi Islam? I'm going to oversimplify a bit, but I felt I should say something about it. Zaydis trace their origins to the name Zayd ibn Ali, ibn al-Hussein, ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, one of the great grandsons of the Prophet Muhammad, who raised a revolt against the Caliph Hisham, an ill-fated revolt, as many of these revolts were. Zaydis generally, they all recognize and admire Zayd ibn Ali, but they do not generally feel wedded to his legal opinions as they've been transmitted over the centuries. And so that's something to keep in mind. Zaydis are normally classified as Shiites, but they have many significant differences that I really won't have much time to get into with Imami and Ismaili Shiites, everything ranging from the concept of the Imam to even certain legal practices that have been studied. Zaydis, like Imami Shia, adopted and modified, you might say as well, aspects of Mu'tazili theology over the centuries, and that's a fascinating story for another talk. The legal school, interestingly enough, at least until pretty recently, and maybe still now, generally frames itself or claims to be the madhab of the Ahl Bayt, that they are the true school of the legal school of the family of the Prophet. And many of the most prominent jurists in the tradition are Sayyids and Imams in the eyes of Zaydis as well, even though jurisprudence was engaged in by both descendants of the Prophet and regular, I guess, Muslims. Zaydis are very much in conversation with the Sunni legal tradition, as something I've been finding as I do research on Zaydi Quran commentaries on legal passages. They're very aware of the differences between especially the Shafi'is and the Hanafis, but they're also aware of other opinions too. And finally, the concept of the Imam. This is an abridged version. It's ideally as a master religious scholar, should lead a military revolt against injustice, and must be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his grandsons Al-Hassan or Al-Hussein. I shouldn't say you don't have to be a descendant of both, even though there are some people who have been, but one is sufficient. And so this is just, we have a picture here in the upper right corner of Imam Ahmed, who was the Zaydi Imam in Yemen from 1948 until 1962, when he was overthrown. Okay, why is it hard to find Zaydi tafsir? Well, that's a good question to start with. As I already mentioned, and as Ahmed even mentioned in his introduction, there are virtually no Western language sources that I've come across on Zaydi tafsir. So that's the first challenge. Even the newly published Oxford Handbook, which I stress is an excellent book, will not help you get your research on Zaydi tafsir very far. Fortunately, we have Arabic sources. And I encourage anyone who seeks to do research on Zaydi thought, especially, I'd say, pre-17th century. The scholar, Dr. Murtada al-Muhatwari, wrote a short work called Az-Zaydiyya that was published just a year before he was tragically assassinated in Sana'a. And within this book, there is a chapter, as you can tell, the most important books of the Zaydis. And it's arranged thematically. It has some notes on some of the imams as who they are, or authors, I should say. They're not just imams, but who the authors are. And it gives you insight into what a traditionally trained Zaydi scholar in the early 21st century thought were still the most important books, and their sort of status as far as publication or not. A more expansive work that's extremely useful is Abdullah al-Hibshi's Masadir al-Fikr al-Islami for Yemen, which includes, it's arranged by discipline, so it's very useful. You can find the legal works, the hadith works, Quran's at the beginning, of course, and it includes all three major traditions within Yemen: Sunni works, Ismaili works, and Zaydi works. So it's a fascinating and very valuable resource. And if you use it, just beware that all the Imams' writings are put in the back. I think the Imams' writings were published as a separate book. So when you go to the thematic section, you're not going to find any of the Imams there, even though they wrote many, many works. And then finally, the most comprehensive biographical dictionary of Zaydi scholars, which I don't believe has an index by subject. So you have to kind of know who you're looking for. It's arranged alphabetically, is the A'lam Mu'allifin Zaydiyya. It has copious notes on the existence of works and manuscript and which libraries have them and so forth. There are multiple Zaydi communities. So as you'll notice today, I'm focusing only on the Yemeni Zaydi community, and we'll see what perhaps in a little bit. There are very few published Zaydi commentaries. I counted about 5, and 2 of them are only partially published. So that's also makes it more difficult and forces us to come face to face with manuscripts, which is something I was terrified of in graduate school, which maybe is why I studied Sunni Hadith, because there's a lot of that that's been published for a long time. But as I grew older and perhaps less cautious, I started venturing into the world of manuscripts, and I haven't been able to get out. So it's a very exciting place to be. Part of the complexity of the Zaydis relates to their very interesting early history. You had communities in Kufa, you had communities in the Caspian region and in Medina, all with their own imams sometimes, or certainly religious authorities, composing books, often hadith books. And such was the situation that if you were to go back to, say, the 11th century, the most productive and vibrant Zaydi intellectual hubs were actually in northern Iraq. And I don't want to knock, pre-12th century Yemen too much, but we don't have very many texts, even from the pre-12th century of the Common Era, that really, even though Imam al-Hadi left Medina and set up the first imamate at the tail end of the 9th century, and he wrote quite a few treatises, but in those ensuing centuries, there isn't as much material. What I'm most interested in is the period after the Great Migration of Books. And this migration has been documented very thoroughly by Professors Sabina Schmittke and Hassan Ansari at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And they have a forthcoming book, I believe, on this topic in great detail, which is wonderful. During the reign of the Imam Ahmed ibn Sulaiman, one of the many mutawakkils ala Allah, so we sometimes just call him Imam Ahmed ibn Sulaiman, plus Ahmed's a really nice name. During his reign, he sent this remarkable jurist and scholar, Qadi Ja'far, who had initially been Ismaili, and then he converted supposedly to Zaydism. And he went all the way to Rai with presumably some helpers and brought back a significant corpus of religious books, both Zaydi and Mu'tazili. And many of these books survive today only because they were brought back from Rai, which was a real hub for Zaydi thought in the 12th century, back all the way to Yemen successfully. There were also some enterprising Khorasani scholars who traveled all the way to Yemen. I guess they got wind that if you're a Zaydi, it's a nice place to be in northern Yemen. You don't have to answer a lot of questions. You're left alone to do what you want to do. And so someone like Tajuddin al-Bayhaqi, who arrived around the year 1213, 1214, brought a whole large load of books as well, including many Sunni works that were not easily accessible in the northern highlands. So unsurprisingly, over the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, we see a whole range of new books being composed. A lot of these books have survived in manuscript, and some of them, as we'll see, are Quran commentaries. Before we get to that, let's just say, maybe you're wondering right now, boy, where can I find Zaydi manuscripts? So we have quite a few online resources thanks to the labors of others. And so really none of my work would be possible without the work that people have done to bring these various manuscripts so that they are accessible. The Zaydi manuscript tradition at the Institute for Advanced Study is a very useful resource. It's not always easy to find things yet, but I think that's going to change in the near future. Another resource that I only became aware of a month or two ago is the Maktaba Muassasat Imam Zayd ibn Ali al-Thaqafiyya, which is hosted by the Ministry of Endowments and Islamic Affairs of the Republic of Yemen, or probably the Houthi government of Yemen. And so that has hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts and their images. And most of the titles align with the images of the manuscript. They don't always, but certainly there's some amazing things that I hadn't seen anywhere else on this resource. And then a smaller but very well photographed and useful corpus is the Yemeni Manuscript Digitization Initiative that's hosted by the Princeton University Digital Library. And as you'll see, the main book I'm writing my book on is actually hosted there. If you're in Chicago right now, you're conveniently located between two of the most useful resources for Zaidi research. So there are no excuses, Chicago people. You're located at Notre Dame University, at the library there. The entire Ambrosiana collection, or the vast majority of it, has been put on microfilm. And while most of the collection is Latin, fortunately, the Arabic books were included, at least in the new series. And the new series is where most of the Zaidi material and Yemeni material is. So that's accessible. The library staff is extremely helpful there. And then if you go the other direction to St. Louis University hosts or houses the microfilms of the entire Vatican collection, including the Arabic manuscripts. And so that's another resource you have right there. It's a smaller collection than the Ambrosiana, but it's available for those of you who are in the Midwest or pass through there from time to time. Of course, the European libraries have quite a few. Many of these images are available online. The ones where I say ZMT, those are accessible through the Princeton website. So actually, the Austrian National Library's microfilms are all accessible through it's ultimately through the Hill Museum, but you can access them through the Institute for Advanced Study website as well. And then finally, of course, in Yemen, there are many libraries, but they've been inaccessible for some time for obvious reasons. And the Mahad al-Makhtutat al-Arabiya has an online presence, and it's possible, I've heard, to order microfilm images from them as well. So what I'm dealing with a lot of the time are microfilm images. And so I thought I would just share with you three images from a tafsir. I have an article that should be forthcoming in the fall, Ibn Abi al-Qasim's Tajrid al-Kashaf, as you can tell from the title. It's based on a Kashaf, but it also draws heavily on other Sunni tafsir works, which I found interesting. He cites al-Wahadi's al-Wasit a lot. He cites even Ibn al-Jawzi's Zad al-Masir quite a bit, and a little bit of Tha'alabi and a little bit of Jishmi, which we would expect as well. And so something you might notice too is that especially with tafsir, the handwriting is often very small, I guess because these are longer works. So you want to make sure you have images that you can zoom in on so that you can actually see all the subtleties that are there. One thing that makes the Zaidi tafsir tradition a little bit complicated is that the two most popular works were not written by Zaidis, or at least when they were written, the authors were probably not Zaidis. The larger of the two is Al-Hakam al-Jishmi, which by a sheer miracle, I was able to get over Amazon, believe it or not. I got that whole book over Amazon Prime. It took 6 months, but it was Amazon. It did come to my doorstep eventually, which was only published very recently in a lovely critical edition. And so this work and almost all the manuscripts upon which it was based are of Yemeni provenance. So a big part of the Zaidi tafsir tradition is copying and incorporating aspects of Al-Hakam al-Jishmi's tafsir, which otherwise would have been lost. I think it's the largest Mu'tazili tafsir we have that survived and at least been published. And it's a lovely book. Suleiman Murad has done some important work on it. I believe he's preparing a monograph on this book as well. But it's arranged according to 8 categories of exegesis. And usually Jishmi includes at least 5 or 6 of them. He doesn't have all 8 every time. And the only sort of shortcoming, if I may say, is he doesn't really tell us what his sources are. So there's a little bit of guesswork involved. From the little bits I've looked at, he's drawing very heavily on Tha'alabi, which makes sense. That's what we would expect given where Jishmi lived and the importance of Tha'alabi, as Walid Saleh has shown and argued in many pieces. And he seems to have access to some Mu'tazili tafsir as well, as we'll see. The other very popular work was Abu Qasim Mahmud bin Omar al-Zamakhshari's Al-Kashaf, a famous work which actually was dedicated to a Zaidi, which is kind of interesting. In the introduction, he dedicates it to a Zaidi commander or governor of Mecca at the time. And so we find many, many copies of the Kashaf. And as we'll see when I have my preliminary overview, there's a whole genre of, whether it's glosses or abridgments or expansions, you might even say, of a kashaf that takes place in Yemen. And this is just a lovely picture. Many of you might know, but the Princeton University Library has a wonderful collection of kashaf manuscripts. I looked at over 20 when I had an opportunity many years ago. And this one right here was copied at the Mustansariya Madrasa in Baghdad just a few years before the Mongols rolled in. So this shows obviously that not all the books were burned because this one survived. But nonetheless, there's a great trove of kashaf. If you're into the kashaf, do try to visit New Jersey sometime when the libraries are open. All right, let's pretend we're Zaidi scholars. And we want to know what the ruh and this mysterious verse in Surah Al-Isra means. وَيَسَأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. What does ruh mean here? Well, first, because the tahdib of Jishmi arrived at my house, I'm going to look there first. And wow, when you look at what ruh can mean, we get 7 different meanings, 7 different possible meanings. Of course, Jishmi tells us, Mashayikh, our teachers say this is what it means, but we have the Mu'tazili opinion of Abu Hudayl here. And then as we get further, we have some other ones, like the Quran can be a ruh. Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the Quran as ruh maybe meaning the Quran because it gives life, to the religion. And then the next question is, well, which ruh is being asked about in this specific verse? And this is very abridged. The whole commentary is several pages. And Jishmi tells us, well, there are 3 possibilities. It could be that the people doing the asking, and they're either polytheists of Mecca, they're either Jews of Medina, maybe somebody else, whoever is doing the asking could be asking about the angel Gabriel. Okay, that's one possibility. They could be asking about the spirit or the soul. And if you look at translations, I looked at a few, almost all of them translate ruh here as spirit, in the English translations, that is. Or it could be the Quran. And very interestingly, Jishmi, and I don't have time to get into his arguments, but he says the correct opinion is actually this verse is about the Quran. It's not about the soul. And that opens a whole host of interesting questions. And he addresses the soul. He says, okay, here's if it is the soul, what the implications are. But that's kind of an interesting reading. If we go to Zamakhshari now, because it's a little bit shorter, Zamakhshari confirms maybe what we assumed initially. Oh, this is about the soul or the spirit or something that relates to life. But he also provides as alternatives without really comment. It could be a huge spiritual being. It could be Gabriel, and it could be the Quran. So apparently the interpretation of this is the Quran did circulate in some places, even though Zamakhshari wasn't convinced that's what was being asked about in this verse. All right, the moment everybody's been waiting for, right? What is the preliminary classification of Yemeni Zaidi tafsir? And I highlight anything with a red asterisk to the best of my knowledge is still in manuscript. If you have a published version of it, please do let me know after the talk. That'll be very helpful because it often is easier to work through published text than manuscripts. I mentioned these first 3 works, whether they should be really considered Yemeni is questionable. Zayd ibn Ali, of course, I don't think ever went to Yemen. And there are a lot of questions whether it really is, whether the commentary in his name that's been published is authentic or not. But I put it up there because he is an early Imam. Imam al-Hadi wrote several treatises that deal especially with theologically relevant verses. And so that should be considered part of tafsir, and it will be in my chapter, as well as a little commentary we'll see as well. And then another Imam who is fascinating because he seems to have espoused belief in the Mahdi akin to the belief of the Mahdi among the 12er Shia, of a hidden Imam and things like that, which most Zaydis do not generally accept that. He seems to have espoused views of this nature. Nonetheless, he wrote a short work on Quran commentary as well. Well, let's turn a little bit now more toward more general, sort of the time period I'm more comfortable in. And we see that, for example, this little tradition here is all in manuscript. Now, the manuscripts are accessible, sort of. But that's probably why it's going to take a little work to figure out what's going on there. I mentioned the Kashaf base. This includes Ibn Abi al-Qasim's tafsir, which I would classify. I'm working on a new paradigm of tafsir called reader-friendly tafsir. I haven't fully fleshed it out yet, but it's the kind of tafsir that at the end of the day, you can just pull it off the shelf and you get the answers you're looking for before you fall asleep, unlike encyclopedic ones, which can really be a little bit taxing. They're rewarding, but they can be difficult to find maybe what we're looking for. And then I just put this one here. I haven't read it yet, but there's some manuscripts online of this tafsir. I believe Kalkabani was a contemporary of Shawkani. I'm not putting Shawkani here because his tafsir, at least, doesn't really have many traces of the Zaydi tradition, unlike his hadith commentary, which will report Zaydi legal positions. The parts of Shawkani's commentary I've looked at, I haven't really noticed anything terribly Zaydi. And then the genre I'm spending most of my time on, and which aligned nicely with my research interest, is that on the legal verses of the Quran. And I only put Muhammad ibn al-Hadi in blue here because that's the main one I'm working on. But as you can see, his work inspired scholars in the subsequent century to work on this. And then there's a separate work that's very useful and been published by Muhammad ibn Hussein ibn al-Qasim. There's one I'm going to call sectarian, and I'm going to talk a little more about this published tafsir as well by Abdullah bin Ahmed al-Sharafi, who lived in Shihara during the time of a sort of resurgent Zaydi imamate in the wake that ultimately pressured the Ottomans to leave. And then there, if you're interested in abrogation, there is a tradition of nasikh and mansukh works. I confess I haven't had time to look at that yet, but it's there if you're curious about those things. And some have even been published. Here's the answer to the question. Wow, he mentioned a lot of Quran commentaries and manuscript. I wonder which one we should start with. And so one of the ones that would be really nice if someone is looking for a large book to edit is Atiyah Najrani, because he lives in this time period right after all these books from Iran have been imported to Yemen. He's drawing on Daylami's Quran commentary quite openly because he quotes it, verbatim. Daylami's is much shorter. It's comprehensive. It appears to cover the whole Quran, not just legal verses. There are not a lot of manuscripts of this that I'm aware of. And sometimes the images are a little blurry. That's just what happens sometimes. But this would be a very valuable tafsir to really look into, because then we'd be able to assess the influence of this work, of course, on subsequent works, and try to figure out what exactly the sources are that Atiyah Najrani is using. So this is just an example of something. And once again, another type of photograph we sometimes get of manuscripts. I'd like to talk about Sharafi's very Zaydi tafsir a little bit, because this might be what we would expect, a sectarian group like the Zaydis, any sectarian group, to espouse. So Sharafi, writing in the 17th century, had a goal. He wanted to write a tafsir that was based just on what the imams taught. Makes sense. Why not? His first problem was not many imams wrote tafsir. So that was his first challenge. He had to overcome that. And then the early imams who did, including the very prestigious Imam al-Qasim ibn Ibrahim, whom Wilfred Madelung wrote a book about more than half a century ago, he started writing a Quran commentary, but he did something a little bit different. After writing a brief few notes on the first chapter of the Quran, Imam al-Qasim went to the back of the Quran and started with Surah An-Nas, 114th surah, then the 113th, 112th, and he only got to Surah Al-Duha, which isn't really very far, before he stopped. I don't know if it was because of his life ending or he just got tired and had other projects. His son continued this and finished almost the final juz, which was nice. And then his grandson, Imam al-Hadi al-Haq, the imam who brought Zaydism to Yemen initially, he made a little more progress, but by the time of his death, really only about a 15th of the Quran had received commentary. And not only that, it was structured in such a way that you kind of had to keep going in reverse order of surahs, right? They'd gotten far enough into the Quran that would be very hard now all of a sudden to start with Surah Al-Baqarah and then go the reverse order and sort of meet up in the middle. So Sharafi had a challenge and he decided to supplement it. And it looks like he made it all the way to the second surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, going in sort of reverse order. The published edition, at least the one that I was able to download online, was up to Surah 30, up to Surah Al-Rum, which isn't even really half the Quran. But I did stumble across a manuscript of the last, or I should say, Surah Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, and Surah Al-Nisa in very, very small script. So it looks like Sharafi did finish the tafsir all the way to the end. And I think that this was coming out right around the time of a series of wars in Saada where it was being edited. And I assume that's what led to the stop and the cessation in its publication. So Sharafi draws on some of the earlier works like Daylami, Ayani. He also draws on the Tajrid al-Kashaf that I've been talking about as my reader-friendly tafsir. as well as a Kashaf, and even Razi's, everyone had to engage Razi, right? That's just once, there was no avoiding Razi if you want to study tafsir. And so occasionally he'll engage, usually for grammatical points, not so much for theological points. And then to make things even more exciting, the editors slid in a couple more tafsirs, especially that Zayd ibn Ali, which interestingly, Sharafi doesn't seem to quote the tafsir of Zayd ascribed to Zayd ibn Ali. But anyway, this in the supplements, you actually have these other texts that are being edited. So it's a fascinating work if you're interested, but it seems also to not have been that popular. The editors claim they only had a couple manuscripts on which to base their edition. And so this format, despite its showcasing, you might say, the Zaydi Imam's interpretations, didn't really get as far as one might have expected. So now I'm going to talk a little more about the tradition, a little bit about the tradition I'm most familiar with, which is usually what you should do when you give a talk in front of highly educated people. So this part is the tradition on the legal verses. And I'm starting with Muhammad ibn al-Hadith. The title of his book tells you that these are legal verses, right? It's Al-Ayat al-Shar'iyya is in the title. I'll be referring to this as the garden and the pool, just for the shorthand, and often it's just called Al-Rawda is how it's known. This book was expanded extensively by Yusuf the Jurist in The Ripe Fruits, which has been published. But something I noticed is that Yusuf the Jurist says much less about each legal verse and includes many, many more verses. So that's interesting. Ibn al-Hadi only includes 199 passages. He may have been aiming for 200, but whatever the case may be, he got 199, as opposed to the more typical 500, sometimes even more, that we find. Yusuf's book was abridged by Fakhruddin al-Najri, and then I mentioned there's another work that's independent of this that draws on even more Sunni sources from the 17th century that merits a closer read. This is the main manuscript I'm using. As you can see, it's pretty nice. It's through the Princeton University Digital Library. You can zoom in incredibly close through their options that you have there. And I think now the Princeton libraries are actually cataloged, so you can just search for this book and get right to it. You don't have to find the right sub-library in which it's housed. Why is Ibn al-Hadi interesting? Well, he lived during an exciting time. This is really in the wake of the arrival of all these books, as I've mentioned, from Persia and Iraq and elsewhere. So the Zaydi tradition in Yemen is really at full swing. He is a 13th generation descendant of Imam al-Hadi al-Haq, so he's part of a very illustrious family. He may have felt some pressure to do something special. His grandfather was governor of Saada for many years, Tajuddin. His great uncle is the famous Hussein ibn Badr ad-Din, who wrote the most popular hadith work on legal hadith, Shifa al-Awam, which has been published, as well as a host of other works. So he had some good scholarly inspiration. His father was a scholar who seems to have transmitted books rather than writing books that are original, but nonetheless, he received a lot of great books from his father, who seems to have lived in the north as well. His uncle, Ibrahim, was briefly imam, but he was captured by the far stronger Rasulids and seems to have died in prison in Taiz, which was the base of the Rasulids. He served in some capacity. The sources are very vague as to what that capacity was, and there are even indications he may have criticized some of the actions of the Imam al-Mutahhar ibn Yahya. He wrote a work on legal theory. There's only one copy of this book that exists in the world, and it's at the British Library. And certainly before the pandemic, British Library was reasonably affordable for getting images of manuscripts. It always takes a little time, so plan ahead. But they had an affordable billing structure, and so this is available. I don't know if you can get to it through their website, but certainly it's there and it survives. And it's a fascinating book. Ibn al-Hadi also wrote an Ijazah that tells us his exact sources for hadith, which is very helpful for putting together what he did. His own son, Ahmed, passed away during his lifetime. So that's something just maybe to keep in mind as we're reading his book. And he died in a village called Afq, which fortunately Google Maps located for me. And it's near the city of Damar, which is sort of the southern extremity of where Zaydis have traditionally had influence and intellectual centers. Since this is the University of Chicago, I thought I'd share a little Arabic text with everybody, even though it's Friday afternoon. This is, I think, a really nice example from Ibn al-Hadi's tafsir. It's a short example. It shows how he used a verse that at first glance does not have maybe obvious legal implications. And it gives us a little insight, I think, into his style as well. You'll also notice that this is a manuscript and it looks a little different from the other one. This is a holograph manuscript in Ibn al-Hadi's own hand. He actually wrote this text. It survives in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, which means they're microfilms at Notre Dame. As you can see, Yemeni scribes traditionally don't write many dots to distinguish the different letters. So as if, reading Arabic was, if it's getting too easy for you, just pull out some Yemeni manuscripts and, it's exciting. It's an adventure. Regrettably, this manuscript only contains the last third or so of the text. So it's very useful for the surahs starting from the middle of Surah Yusuf all the way to the end. For the earlier surahs in the Quran, one has to go elsewhere to find that. So you can see, I highlighted just some of the guiding features of the work. This is the second verse, Al-Ayat Thaniya, in the Surah Al-Hajj. And he starts it here. Usually he gives you the whole verse. I guess he was feeling tired and he just said Al-Ayah here, but usually he gives you the whole verse. And then the first section is about Locha, right? So he just explains the meaning of the word Khasam. The second is Nuzul, the occasions of revelation. He gives a whole bunch of reports. And then Ma'ana continues their meaning on the other page. All of the content you see here and most of the Ma'ana is right out of Jishmi. It's just taken right out of it, which is kind of what you would expect because it follows that pattern. Where the original material comes in is in the legal section. And this is something I typed up a little bit quickly, so please forgive any mistakes in here, but the Ahkam section. And this is where Jishmi is not as useful, although to be fair, Jishmi does address the issue in this verse, which is whether non-Muslims are all to be considered as a single sect or as different sects, as well as the question of interconfessional inheritance, which is a topic perhaps more important in countries where you have converts and other types of people. But whatever the case may be, this is an old issue. And so this is one of the verses, as you can see, that Ibn al-Hadi tells us that the Hanafis use to argue that all disbelievers should be considered a single millah. Whether they're Jews, Christians, anything else, they should all be considered a single community. Ibn al-Hadi tells us, right, using indana, that's how we know his opinion, that's not our opinion. Right, so it's interesting because sometimes Zaydis are described as being basically Hanafis, and often there is agreement. I don't want to disagree, but here's a case where actually the Zaydis are not agreeing with the mainline Hanafi position. And he says, look, this is the opinion of the Ahl Bayt, right? This is a frequent claim in Zaydi texts, and Shafi'i also agrees, and most scholars. Then he gives some examples here of, okay, I'm kind of blocking the text a little, but he gives us some hadith. Oh, then he moves on, to the next topic, which is the inheritance question. And the first question is whether Jews can inherit from Christians, if Christians can inherit from Jews, right? That kind of question is up there as well. And for Ibn al-Hadi, the answer is no. And he quotes quite a few hadith. These hadith are found in the Sunni collections. They're very famous. They're also found in Zaydi collections. And he quotes a variety of variations. There are quite a few hadith in this Quran commentary, which maybe shouldn't come as a surprise. So what's the next topic? Okay, now we have the question of Muslims inheriting from non-Muslims. And I highlighted this issue in part out of honor of the fact that I was invited by the Shiite studies groups, because one of the interesting differences between Shiites and Sunnis, right, is that Shiites generally allow Muslims to inherit from non-Muslims, but they don't allow non-Muslims to inherit from Muslims, right? So this is an interesting position. And Ibn al-Hadi recognizes that the Imamis, this is the only place in the whole section here he mentions the Imamiyah, right? But he also has to mention them because one of the Zaydi Imams, Nasr al-Utrush, who was a Caspian Imam who was contemporary with Imam al-Hadi, he frequently has opinions that align more with the Imamiyah. And so they had to acknowledge and kind of explain these various interpretations, or certainly Ibn al-Hadi had to, and other Zaydi scholars did too. So he's saying, right, a Muslim can inherit from a Milli, which presumably a non-Muslim, and maybe even Mu'adh, the companion, agreed with that as well. And so we get the evidence, right? This is a famous hadith that's found in Bukhari and many other hadith collections, although Ibn al-Hadi doesn't really tell you where it's found, about, it explicitly lays out the rule. And then sort of out of courtesy, and maybe because the Zaydi Imam held this opinion, Ibn al-Hadi mentions the hadith that might support the other position, right? So sometimes he gives the opposing positions evidence as well. This idea that Islam increases and cannot decrease, so we can inherit from them, but they can't inherit from us. And then we have a little discussion of the apostate. We don't need to worry about apostates. It's Friday. But at the very bottom, I just want to point out, he does quote the Musnad Zayd ibn Ali. If you're wondering, okay, we don't know about the authenticity so much about either of these works ascribed to Zayd ibn Ali, but at least it's interesting this Musnad, or the Majmu'ah, as it's often called, the Zayd ibn Ali, is cited somewhat frequently by Ibn al-Hadi. I'd like to close up with the sort of reflections a bit on how Shiite is Zaydi tafsir. And I realize there's no scale for measuring Shiism or Sunnism or things of that nature. I think in Zaydi tafsir, it's pretty evident there's a strong prominence of the successor generation authorities, men like Mujahid, Qatada, people we're familiar with in Sunni tafsir. I think these names also probably appear quite frequently in Shiite tafsir as well. The citation of famous Sunni books was quite striking to me as I was reading Ibn Abi al-Qasim's Tajrid al-Kashaf. The structure of the legal commentaries in the Sunni tradition, they're arranged according to the order of the surahs, not the topics, the legal topics, and the Zaydis follow the Sunnis in this regard. They also arrange their works according to the order of the surahs, as opposed to the Imami Shia, like Muqtada Suyuri, whose work is arranged according to legal topics. The Sunni legal discourse is very prominent, as hopefully that little excerpt showed. The prominence of Sunni hadith is also very prominent. And there are very few references that I've come across so far to Imami Shi'i positions in any of these tafsir works. What maybe makes them more Shiite, on the other hand, tipping the balance the other way, is the authority of the consensus of the family of the Prophet, something Sunnis generally do not recognize, but that Zaydis wield frequently. If maybe they don't have any other evidence, they'll say, well, the family of the Prophet agrees on this. That's a proof for them, a legal proof. The authority of Ali is sufficient, even if the hadith doesn't go all the way back to the Prophet. If just Ali says something, that's sufficient proof for the Zaydis as well. And of course, we find many Shi'i blessings after Ali and the Prophet that we wouldn't expect to find in Sunni sources. In the article that is forthcoming, in the first iteration, I propose that maybe Zaydis should be considered critical Sunnis rather than Shiites. Unsurprisingly, the reviewers did not like that suggestion, and so I am currently rethinking that and would certainly welcome any of your suggestions regarding that as well. Thank you so much for coming today.
So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for all of you for attending and asking these questions. And I hope to see you all again next Friday for our next lecture. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.